two fragile hearts buried beneath 6 feet of snow. No heat, no food, no way out. A mother clutching her son, his tiny chest fighting each beat because his heart was born broken. And the storm, it didn't care. But someone else did. A small-town police officer, and his canine partner trained to find the lost, the wounded, the forgotten. What they uncovered in that blizzard wasn't just a rescue. It was a second chance, one that would change all their lives forever. What happened next will melt your heart, bring you to tears, and restore your faith in human compassion. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds you, sometimes heroes walk on 2 legs, and sometimes they walk on 4. The town of Silver Hollow, nestled in the mountainous stretch of northern Montana, had gone still buried under a punishing blizzard that howled through pine and timber with the voice of a beast. It was nearly midnight, but the snowstorm had erased all sense of time. The roads were invisible, power lines sagged under layers of ice. And yet, Officer Ethan Granger, bundled in his thick police-issued parka, kept driving. Snow pelted the windshield of his patrol SUV like sharp nails, his gloved hands tight on the wheel. His canine partner, Shadow, sat alert in the passenger seat, ears twitching at every noise that the storm tried to mask. Ethan was 28, lean and wiry from years of fieldwork, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a jawline that always looked a little too tight. He was a man who carried his silence like a badge, shaped by years of expectations he never asked for. Raised by a single mother who had been a dispatcher for the very precinct he now served, Ethan had spent much of his life running toward responsibility and away from emotion. But tonight, emotion found him anyway, blinking on his phone screen as a text came in from his sister. "Mom's back in ICU. Docs say maybe 48 hours. Come if you can." He locked the screen. He couldn't. Not now. Not with the storm sealing the town in like a coffin. His duty kept him here, checking on the forgotten cabins in the hills, the elderly with no phones, the families off-grid. He glanced at Shadow, who turned to meet his eyes with that unwavering, knowing stare. Shadow had always known. The dog was a 5-year-old German shepherd, large-boned with a sable coat that shimmered like dusk under the SUV's dashboard light. Shadow wasn't bred from a line of show dogs. He'd been a stray once, found half dead near a forest fire in Oregon. Ethan had been the one to carry him out. And since then, they had been inseparable partners, not just in duty, but in survival. Where Ethan's strength was in his logic, Shadow's lay in instinct. And right now, that instinct kicked in hard. The shepherd's ears stiffened. He let out a short bark, then another, sharp, urgent. Ethan stopped the SUV. "What is it, boy?" Shadow growled low in his throat and pawed at the door. The wind was screaming outside, but the dog wasn't reacting to that. Ethan opened the door, stepping into a wall of ice-cold air that instantly burned his skin. Shadow leapt out, nose to the snow, heading toward the tree line where a faint mound was barely visible. Ethan followed, boots crunching in snow that had swallowed the world. That's when he saw it. A collapsed shelter, crudely fashioned from branches and snow, half covered now by fresh drifts. Shadow barked, then began digging frantically at the mound. Ethan dropped to his knees, brushing away layers of snow with gloved hands until he reached the tarp beneath. He yanked it back and froze. Inside was a woman, curled around a small boy. The woman was shivering violently, her breath rapid, shallow. Her face was pinched and wind-burned, her lips tinged with blue. Her arms clutched the child like he was the last source of heat in the world. The boy, maybe 7 years old, was limp, too still. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open, his lashes rimmed with frost. "Ma'am," Ethan said, lowering his voice as gently as he could, "can you hear me?" The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were green, glassy with exhaustion and fear. She tried to speak, but only a croak came out. "My name's Ethan Granger," he said. "I'm a police officer. You're safe now. We're gonna get you warm. You and your son." "Mason," she rasped. "His name's Mason. He has heart." Her eyes rolled back as she passed out. Ethan's training kicked in. He quickly checked Mason's pulse faint, fluttering. The boy was burning up. Fever. Likely a complication from exposure and his heart condition. They needed heat. Fast. No time to call it in. No ambulance would get through in this weather. The only option was the ranger cabin, about a mile back along the road. It had a generator, a cot, and a wood stove. That would have to be enough. Ethan wrapped both mother and child in the emergency thermal blankets from his pack and hoisted the boy into his arms. Shadow stayed close, tail low, ears back. Ethan looked down at the woman. Her frame was light, almost too light, maybe 5'6", thin like she'd known hunger. Her clothes were threadbare under the parka, worn jeans and an oversized hoodie stained with what looked like oil or smoke. Her name was Rachel Myers, and she looked like someone who'd once fought hard and lost. Shadow stayed behind Ethan as he carried them one by one to the SUV. The snow had nearly swallowed his tire tracks already. He slid Mason into the back seat, then returned for Rachel. As he secured her in, the boy suddenly twitched, moaned. Ethan reached back, touched the boy's cheek, burning. "You hang in there, kid," he murmured. "You're not dying on me tonight." Shadow jumped back into the front seat, eyes trained on Mason. As the SUV pulled onto the road again, Ethan reached for the heater dial and felt the cold metal of his phone in his pocket. He thought about his mother, her breathing machines, the way she used to wake him up with country music and scrambled eggs when he was a boy. He swallowed hard. Then he drove into the snow. The SUV skidded sideways as Ethan took the turn, tires barely gripping the snow-packed road that wound toward the Ranger cabin. His heart pounded against his ribs, not from the driving, but from the boy in the back seat. Mason had begun to moan softly, a thin sound that twisted like wire in Ethan's gut. Rachel stirred beside her son, still pale and trembling, her head rolling weakly against the backrest. She was conscious again, barely, whispering his name like a prayer. "Mason, Mason, baby." Ethan glanced at the GPS screen, which had long since given up, frozen over and useless. He knew the way by memory now. The Ranger cabin was no more than 10 minutes out, a former fire tower checkpoint, long abandoned but recently restored by the Forest Patrol. If he could get there, if the generator still worked, if the old radio still transmitted, if the medicine locker hadn't been cleaned out, too many ifs, and time was folding in on them. "Hang on, kid," he muttered, pressing the gas gently. "Hang on for me." Then Mason seized. It started with a jerk, his back arching, hands curling, eyes rolling white. Rachel woke fully at the movement, reaching instinctively, but her hands were shaking too hard. "No, no, no, not now," she rasped. "Ethan, he's having an attack." Ethan braked hard, the SUV fishtailing slightly before coming to a halt. He jumped out, yanked the back door open. The cold rushed in like a blade. Mason's body was spasming, then went eerily still. His breaths came in short, hiccuping gasps. Ethan lifted the boy into his arms again. Mason's small body was burning hot, but the cold from outside was already fighting that heat. "Shadow!" he barked. The German shepherd leapt out immediately, his paws disappearing into the thick snow. Ethan laid Mason gently across the back seat, then motioned to Shadow. "Lie with him. Keep his core warm. Stay." Shadow obeyed instantly, curling against the boy's side, his thick fur pressed tightly into Mason's body. The dog's breath fogged in the freezing air, but he didn't move. His eyes watched Ethan's every move, ready. Ethan ran to the back, tore open the gear compartment, and grabbed the portable radio box. It was old, battery-powered, built like a tank. He turned it on, nothing but static. His fingers worked fast, adjusting dials, lifting the antenna, flicking the backup switch. The wind was howling through the trees, drowning out everything. He stepped outside, shielding the radio under his coat. Come on, give me something." A burst of signal popped, then died. He turned again, adjusted. Another crackle. "Hoy Forest Range Channel 4, emergency line copy." It was faint, distant, but it was something. "This is Officer Ethan Granger from Silver Hollow PD," he shouted into the mic. "Emergency medical assistance required. I have a 7-year-old male in cardiac distress, repeat cardiac distress. Requesting air evac if available. Coordinates." He glanced at his watch-linked GPS Grid 4 Delta near Ridgepoint Cabin. Over. There was a long pause, then static again. "Copy that. Storm delay on evac. Nearest ranger station, 2 hours out." Damn it. No airlift, no immediate help. He returned to the SUV where Rachel was now crying silently, her hands still hovering over Mason but too weak to help. "I couldn't keep him warm," she whispered. "I couldn't do it anymore. 2 days, I held him and held him." "Stop," Ethan said gently. "You got him this far. You did more than most people ever could." Rachel looked up at him then, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion and guilt. but there was something else there. Resolve, buried deep. She had once been strong. He could see that now. She was 30, with dark auburn hair matted from sweat and snow, cheekbones sharp from weight loss, and hands that trembled but had clearly once known skill. Not long ago she would have stood straight, confident, with a stethoscope around her neck. Now she clutched a worn scarf like a lifeline. "I was a nurse," she said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "Before all of this." Before? Before he left. Ethan didn't need to ask who he was. Rachel went on, voice monotone now. "My husband couldn't handle the diagnosis. Mason needed surgeries, treatments, so many medications. We had insurance until the job laid him off. Then it got bad. I picked up extra shifts, then he started disappearing. One day he didn't come home at all." She drew her knees to her chest in the seat, eyes still fixed on Mason. "The eviction notice came 3 weeks later. I couldn't pay the hospital anymore. Couldn't even afford the gas to visit the cardiologist. I left the city. Found a shack up here, cheap, cash only. Thought I could keep Mason stable, use what meds we had left. But when the storm hit, her voice cracked. I couldn't get out." The truth hung heavy between them. Ethan exhaled, rubbed a gloved hand across his face. "He's still alive, and we're only a mile out from warmth and supplies. I can't promise a miracle, but I can promise this. He's not dying out here." She nodded slowly, wiping at her cheeks. "Then let's go." Ethan drove the last stretch carefully, wheels slipping, eyes scanning through the swirling snow. Finally, through the fog and white, the ranger cabin appeared half buried in drifts, the windows iced over, but still standing. He pulled the SUV as close as possible, then went to work, carried Mason inside first, laying him on the cot, shadow padded behind, fur crusted with frost, and climbed up next to the boy again without command. Rachel followed, stumbling slightly on the threshold, but Ethan steadied her. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and pine. The backup generator coughed to life with a roar, flooding the room with flickering yellow light. The heater began to hum. Ethan found a thermal blanket, a space heater, and the old emergency med kit. He would inventory it later. For now, he needed to stabilize Mason, get fluids in, control the fever. Rachel leaned over her son, brushing his hair back. Her fingers were steadier now. "You're safe," she whispered. "We're safe." The wind outside hadn't stopped. It moaned like a wounded thing through the pines, slamming dry snow against the wooden walls of the ranger cabin. Inside, the dim yellow light of the generator threw long shadows against the bare floorboards. Ethan crouched near the old cast-iron wood stove, coaxing a small fire to life. Every stick of kindling, every log, felt like it had to matter, because outside was death and inside, barely, was survival. Mason lay curled on the cot wrapped in thermal blankets, his body still too hot. His breathing was shallow but steady. Rachel sat on the floor next to him, one hand pressed lightly against his chest, the other clutching a wet cloth she'd been using to wipe his forehead. She hadn't said much since they arrived. Her auburn hair hung damp around her face, and her shoulders trembled, not from the cold anymore, but from exhaustion and something deeper. Helplessness. Ethan glanced at her, then at the boy, then back at the flame struggling inside the stove. "It's taking," he muttered. "We'll get more heat soon." Rachel nodded but didn't look up. Shadow lay next to Mason again, his thick coat pressed against the boy's legs. His breath rose in slow clouds. The dog hadn't moved much since they got there, as if he'd made a decision and committed to it with the same unwavering loyalty he gave to everything. He looked up now, eyes flicking toward Ethan. "Good boy," Ethan murmured. He grabbed a thick blanket from the emergency locker and draped it over both Mason and the dog. The fire finally gave a soft pop, then glowed warmer. Heat radiated outward. Ethan stood slowly, rolling his stiff shoulders. His uniform was damp with melted snow, his boots frozen around the toes. But there was no time for rest. He crossed the room and checked the shortwave radio mounted on the shelf. It was old World War II era, likely, and had a red low-signal bulb blinking faintly. He adjusted the dial and pressed the receiver. "Silver Hollow Base, this is Granger. Do you copy?" Static. He tried again. Nothing. Finally, a crackling voice cut through. "Granger Base here, reading you faintly. Go ahead." Ethan exhaled in relief. "I've got a medical emergency. 7-year-old male, heart condition. We've made it to Ridgepoint Cabin. Need timeline on evac. Over." The voice crackled. All major routes out of the North Range are closed, heavy drifts, at least 48 hours before plows can reach that area. Repeat, 48 hours minimum. Ethan closed his eyes, jaw clenching. Copy, will hold. The radio went dead again. He didn't tell Rachel. Instead, he grabbed the kettle, poured melted snow into it, and set it on top of the stove. As the room warmed slowly, the kettle began to hiss. You should sleep, he said to her quietly. Rachel shook her head. I can't. Not while he's like this. He's stable for now, Ethan said. The fever's down. His color's a little better. Rachel looked at him finally. Her green eyes were glassy but sharp. You've seen this before. Ethan nodded slowly. Not with kids, but yeah. She studied him a moment longer. You're calm. Too calm. Ethan sat on a nearby chair. I've learned it helps nobody if I panic. Rachel offered a thin smile. Nurses are taught the same. Silence settled over them again, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire and Mason's soft breathing. The kettle whistled louder. Ethan stood and poured the water into a mug, added a tea bag from the cabinet chamomile, old but usable, and handed it to Rachel. She took it with both hands, murmuring a quiet thank you. Then, her voice barely audible, she asked, Has he ever been sick? Ethan didn't have to ask who. Shadow, he said. She nodded. Ethan let out a breath, smiling faintly. Yeah, once. Worst night of my life. Rachel watched him with quiet interest. It was a year ago, Ethan began. We were doing a sting on a meth house outside of town. Shadow was trained to track, but we didn't expect them to run. One guy bolted out the back with a shotgun. I chased him through the woods, didn't wait for backup. He shook his head at the memory. Shadow followed. Just as the guy turned to fire, Shadow launched, took the shot straight to his side, instead of me, still took the bastard down, bled out on the ground while I tried to keep him breathing. Rachel's hands tightened around her mug. They said he wouldn't make it, said he'd lose the leg at best. But he pulled through, never lost the leg, never even limped afterward. And you? Rachel asked softly. What about me? You've never been the same since, have you? Ethan looked at her, surprised. Rachel gave a tired smile. I used to see it in ICU nurses. When they lose a patient, or almost lose one, something behind the eyes, you carry it. Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Shadow, still lying faithfully next to Mason, chest rising and falling like a metronome. He's the best partner I've ever had, Ethan said at last, and the quietest hero I know. Rachel looked down at her son again. He's warming up. Because Shadow's body heat is constant. Canines are amazing regulators. Rachel nodded slowly. I used to know that, used to teach it to parents when they asked how to warm up sick babies. I haven't thought like a nurse in a long time. Maybe it's time to start again. She didn't answer, but the quiet around her changed less. Fragile, more focused. Outside, the wind kept howling, but the inside of the cabin held its line. Ethan checked the stove again, added another log. He rubbed the back of his neck, muscles knotted from tension. His phone was still dead, signal long gone. He thought of his mother in Texas, whether she was still holding on, whether he had missed his chance to say goodbye. Rachel's voice broke the silence again. You've been somewhere else in your head. Ethan didn't lie. My mom's in the hospital, ICU. I got the message just before Shadow picked up your trail. I haven't been able to check back since. I'm sorry, Rachel whispered. He shrugged. Nothing I can do now. That's what hurts. Rachel looked at him. You saved us instead. He didn't respond. The night wore on. Ethan took the floor near the door, letting Rachel rest closer to Mason. The cabin had become a fragile refuge, a bubble of warmth against the brutal cold outside. And within that bubble, 4 souls breathed quietly together. 1 human, 1 dog, 1 mother, 1 boy, and a flickering flame that refused to die. The storm hadn't lessened. If anything, it had settled into the kind of fury that could break trees and cover entire cabins under an avalanche of white. The wind screamed like an animal outside, clawing at the eaves of the ranger cabin as if it could rip its way in. Inside, however, there was quiet, fragile, but steady. The fire in the stove hissed warmly. Mason was still breathing, his fever having broken slightly in the night. Rachel slept with her head on the edge of the cot, her hands still on her son's chest, unmoving except for the rise and fall of his breathing. Shadow, as always, was a statue at Mason's side. Ethan sat at the old table by the wall, turning the dials of the radio with careful fingers. He had been trying for hours to break through the storm's interference, sending bursts of Morse, voice signals, even distress beeps, but nothing was getting out. He looked at the receiver like it was a lifeline being dragged farther and farther from shore. "No response," he muttered under his breath. He leaned back in the rickety wooden chair and rubbed at his eyes. He hadn't slept. Not really. Just short dozes, broken by static and cold wind whistling through the cracks in the window frame. His gaze drifted to a plastic water bottle on the counter, half crushed from the cold. And then the idea came, half memory, half desperation. He stood, walked to the gear pack near the stove, and pulled out a permanent marker, a pocket-sized topographical map, and a strip of gauze. He laid the map flat. 3 miles east was the old Forest Service outpost, manned occasionally by seasonal rangers. It had an antenna tower. If anyone was out there, they might pick up the call. But sending a person across that terrain in this weather was a suicide run. Unless it wasn't a person. Ethan looked at Shadow, whose eyes lifted instantly to meet his. Shadow stood, stretched his legs slowly, shook out his coat, and patted over. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said softly, kneeling to the dog's level. "You up for something?" Shadow tilted his head. Ethan took the bottle, carefully wrote out a message on a strip of gauze. "Officer Ethan Granger, Silver Hollow PD, trapped at Ridgepoint Cabin. 7YO boy in critical condition. Request immediate rescue, snowed in. Please respond via emergency channel 4. He folded the message tightly and slipped it into the bottle, then screwed the cap back on with a piece of twine tied around it. He slipped it into a side pouch on Shadow's K9 vest, securing it under the strap. Then he took out the map and marked the destination with a red X. 3 miles, boy. Over the ridge, past the old quarry trail. You've done worse." Shadow gave a small huff, tail swishing once in acknowledgement. Rachel stirred behind him, blinking groggily. Her voice was husky from sleep and dryness. "What are you doing?" Ethan stood and turned to her. "Sending a message. It's a long shot, but if Shadow can make it to the outpost, they might send help sooner." Rachel looked alarmed. "You're sending him alone? He knows the path, and he's faster than we are. I'd never risk it if I didn't believe he could." Rachel sat up fully, watching the dog, who now stood tall and alert, seeming to understand the gravity of the moment. "Will he come back?" Ethan paused, then answered honestly, "If he can." She looked down, then back up, eyes glassy. "Then he's not just a dog." "No," Ethan said. "He's my partner." He opened the cabin door. A gust of snow-laced wind slammed into the room like a wave. Shadow didn't flinch. Ethan knelt one last time, touched his forehead to the dog's briefly. "Go, hero, and don't stop for anything." Shadow bounded into the white, disappearing like a shadow swallowed by fog. Ethan stood in the doorway long after he was gone, scanning the trees, even though he knew there was no point. Then he closed the door and leaned his back against it. Rachel approached slowly, her eyes on the now empty cot beside Mason. "He'll make it." Ethan gave a short nod. "He always does." She moved to the stove, stirred the small pot of snow water they had been boiling for drinking. "You seem so certain. How do you do that?" Ethan hesitated, then chuckled softly. "It's something my dad used to say." Rachel turned to him, curious. He was a cop too, worked 26 years in Seattle, hard man, big voice, wore his badge like it weighed more than his gun. Rachel leaned against the counter, arms folded for warmth. "One night, after a really bad call, he found me sitting on the front steps, shaken. I'd been doing ride-alongs, still deciding if I wanted the job. I asked him, 'How do you go on when you can't fix everything?' Ethan smiled faintly at the memory, eyes distant. He said, 'Sometimes the hero ain't the strongest guy in the room. Sometimes he's just the one who doesn't quit when everything tells him to walk away.'" Rachel nodded slowly, repeating the words to herself like a silent mantra. "The one who doesn't quit." Ethan looked back toward the door. "That's Shadow. That's who he is." They spent the rest of the morning tending to Mason, checking his pulse, sponging his forehead. His fever was lower now, but his body was weak, too weak. They gave him a few spoonfuls of water mixed with sugar and salt from the emergency rations. He stirred once, whispered, "Mom," and then slipped back into sleep. Rachel wept quietly, not out of panic, but of sheer relief. Outside, the storm kept pounding the mountain, but inside, the fire burned strong, and far away, in the snow-laced forest, a German shepherd ran, bottle tied to his side, heart pounding not with fear, but with purpose. The clock on the cabin wall had long since frozen, its hands stuck at 2:17 a.m. The fire in the stove sputtered and coughed, its last log nearly reduced to embers. Mason lay under 3 layers of blankets, his skin clammy, cheeks flushed deep red. Every few minutes, his body shook with fever chills. Rachel, hollow-eyed and trembling, kept pressing warm cloths to his forehead, but her hands had gone numb from the effort. Ethan sat nearby, watching both of them, but also the door, his ears straining for any sign of movement outside. Snow tapped against the windows like fingers. Then silence. Then a gust of wind, and still no sign of Shadow. "His fever's rising," Rachel whispered, barely audible over the crackling embers. I think he's going into febrile seizure." Ethan stood, hands trembling. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a medic. He was a police officer with basic first aid and a good sense of calm, but that wasn't enough anymore. He went to the first aid kit again, pulling out what was left: aspirin, a water canteen, alcohol wipes. None of it useful against a failing heart and a raging fever in a boy who needed professional help. "I need to cool him down more," Rachel said, almost talking to herself now. "Cold packs, if I wrap his arms and legs." "We're running out of time," Ethan said grimly. He walked toward the window, scraped away the fog on the glass with his sleeve, and stared into the darkness. White. Endless white. No shapes, no motion, just snow and wind and the heavy, bone-deep sense that hope was slipping away. But then something shifted. A flash. A pulse of light, just once cut through the dark, distant and low. Ethan blinked, leaned closer. Another flash. He turned. "Rachel, someone's out there!" She rushed to the window beside him. "You sure?" Another flash, this time closer. A beam of light, swaying slightly, like someone running with a headlamp. And then voices. Distant, muffled, but unmistakably human. "Help!" Rachel's voice cracked. "We're here!" Ethan grabbed his flashlight and opened the cabin door. The wind nearly knocked him back, but he pushed through and signaled with rapid arcs toward the trees. "Over here! Flashing light 3 times. Come toward the sound." Minutes passed like hours. The light grew closer. Then figures appeared, 3 of them, bundled in bright orange snow gear, carrying medical packs and radios. The man in front stopped first and pulled off his goggles. He was in his late 60s, tall with a heavy beard, white as frost. His face was weathered like old leather, but his pale blue eyes were sharp as flint. He pulled off his glove and extended a hand. "Officer Ethan Granger?" Ethan blinked. "Yes?" "Cal Peterson," the man said. "Your dad used to call me that old mountain mule." Ethan stared. "Wait, Cal? Cal from Spokane?" Cal smiled, teeth flashing. "The same. Last time I saw you, you were 7 and upside down in a ditch crying about your baseball yurds." "You pulled me out," Ethan murmured, stunned. "Still dragging Grangers out of trouble, I guess," Cal chuckled. Then, eyes narrowing with purpose, "Where's the boy?" Ethan motioned him inside. Cal barked to the 2 medics, with him both younger men, one African-American with a trimmed beard, and the other a redhead with a quiet focus. Inside, the team moved fast. Cal took the lead, checking Mason's vitals while the others laid out supplies. Rachel hovered, trying to explain between sobs. "He has congenital heart disease. We don't have the meds. We just—" "You did good," Cal said calmly. "You kept him alive in a blizzard. Not many could." He looked at Ethan. "That dog of yours is a hell of a thing. Showed up at the outpost with a bottle tied to his vest. Scratched the hell out of the door till I opened it. Wouldn't leave till I read the note." Is Shadow okay?" Ethan asked. "Little banged up, limping, paws cut, probably from ice shards, but he didn't stop running. Dog like that. You name him Shadow for a reason. Quiet, unshakable." Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't realized how much tension he'd been carrying until now. Outside, one of the medics set up a signal flare. The sky above burst briefly with red and white light. Within minutes, a snowmobile engine roared to life not far from the tree line. A rescue team was coming. Inside the cabin, Mason stirred. Rachel leaned down, tears streaming. "Mason, baby!" His eyes fluttered open, fevered but aware. He tried to speak. His lips moved. "I can't hear him," Rachel choked. Cal leaned close, listening. Then he smiled. He said, "Is Shadow okay?" Rachel sobbed into her hands. Ethan walked to the door, staring at the night sky as more headlights approached in the distance. He felt a strange sense of full circle like the world. For a moment, had tilted back into alignment. Cal clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Your old man would be proud," Cal said quietly. "You stayed. You fought." Ethan nodded, voice thick. "I remembered what he said, about not quitting." "You didn't," Cal said. "Neither did that damn dog." And outside, just barely visible in the snow, a familiar dark shape limped toward the light tail wagging weakly, head held high, as if to say, "I did it." The ambulance roared down the frozen streets of Billings, Montana, lights flashing through the thick veil of snow still falling from the storm's lingering tail. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and wet wool clung to the air as paramedics stabilized Mason, wrapping heated blankets around his tiny, shaking frame. Rachel clutched his hand, her eyes locked on her son's pale lips and fluttering chest. She looked hollowed out, like someone who had given every last ember of herself to keep a single flame alive. She wore exhaustion like armor, her coat still crusted with frost. One boot torn at the sole, her knuckles scraped raw. Her brown hair was matted with melting snow, and her face, though young, was weathered with the kind of worry only a parent facing the unthinkable could carry. Ethan sat stiff beside her, jaw clenched, watching the monitors beep beside Mason. His uniform was damp, his badge dulled with ice. Shadow had been taken separately to the hospital's working animal unit, his injured paw wrapped and carried gently by a technician, who recognized a canine hero when she saw one. As they reached St. Joseph Regional Hospital, orderlies met them at the ambulance bay. Doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and warmth clinical but blessed flooded into the vehicle. Nurses in dark blue scrubs moved quickly, lifting Mason onto a stretcher. 7-year-old male, congenital heart condition, storm exposure, said a paramedic, handing off the chart. A woman stepped forward, mid-50s, tall, with silver hair neatly pinned up and eyes that saw everything. Her name badge read, Dr. Ellen Marsden, Pediatric Cardiology. Her face was unreadable as she quickly examined Mason's chest, noting the shallow breaths and blue tinge in his fingertips. "Vitals?" she asked. "Pulse hold. 90/40, pulse 112, BP falling." She turned to her team. "Let's move. Trauma room B. Keep the mother close." Rachel stumbled forward but was stopped at the entrance. "Ma'am, please wait here while we stabilize him." She reached out instinctively as Mason was wheeled away, her hand grasping air. Ethan placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "They're doing everything they can." Rachel didn't speak. She just nodded and sank into a nearby chair, clutching her coat around her like a lifeline. Her shoulders trembled, not from the cold now, but from sheer emotional depletion. Ethan remained standing, watching through the window as the team worked. Minutes passed. The ticking of the clock on the wall became a metronome to their shared silence. Then Dr. Marsden emerged. "Ms. Myers." Rachel jumped to her feet. "Yes?" "Your son is stable for now, but he needs surgery. His heart is failing faster than we anticipated. Unfortunately, we're not equipped here for the specific procedure he requires." Her words hit like a hammer. "He needs to be transferred to the Montana Children's Heart Center in Helena. They have the pediatric cardiac team and machines necessary, but it must happen within 12 hours, or we risk permanent damage, possibly worse." Rachel's breath caught. 12 hours? Okay. Dr. Marsden hesitated. "But the transfer, surgery, and post-op care are costly. Do you have insurance?" Rachel froze. "No, I don't. I lost my coverage last year when I was laid off. I haven't been able to afford private plans." The silence that followed was deafening. "I'll give you a moment," Dr. Marsden said softly, before turning and disappearing down the hallway. Rachel's face crumpled. "Oh, God." She walked to the window, her reflection a ghost against the glass, and wrapped her arms around herself. "I tried so hard," she whispered. "I gave up everything. I thought if I could just keep him warm, just get through the week." Ethan approached slowly. "You did everything right, Rachel." "No, I didn't," she said, voice cracking. "I failed him. I couldn't keep a job, couldn't afford his meds, and now I can't even pay to save his life." Her knees buckled slightly, but Ethan caught her by the elbow. "Hey, look at me." She did, barely. "You got him through a snowstorm. You wrapped him in your arms for 2 days, with no heat. You kept him alive long enough for us to find you. That's not failing. That's being his hero." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "But what now? I can't give consent for a surgery I can't pay for." Ethan glanced toward the hallway, then pulled out his phone. His hands were firm, methodical. He scrolled through his contacts and paused on a name. Ken Foster, Director, Montana K-9 Medical Support Fund. He moved to the far end of the hallway, his back to Rachel, and pressed call. It rang 3 times. A gruff voice answered. Foster speaking. Ken, it's Ethan Granger. Granger? From Silver Hollow PD? Everything okay? No, not really. I need your help. A pause. Is it Shadow? No, it's not him directly, but it's about what he did and someone who saved him. Ethan looked back at Rachel, who stood still at the window, her hands folded in front of her like she was praying. She's a mother. Her name is Rachel Myers. No insurance. Her son Mason needs cardiac surgery in Helena in less than 12 hours or he won't make it. And she's the reason Shadow made it out alive. I need to know, can the K-9 Support Fund step in for a civilian family as a one-time emergency case? There was a long silence. You're asking me to bend every rule we've written. I know. To fund a child we're not obligated to help. Yes, because sometimes the right thing isn't written on a form. Ken sighed heavily. Let me see what strings I can pull. Thank you, Ethan whispered, relief cracking in his voice. Thank you. He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his coat, taking a deep breath. He turned to Rachel, who was watching him with cautious hope in her eyes. Morning came slowly to Billings. The icy fingers of the storm had finally loosened their grip, and the thick veil of snow that had blanketed the town began to thin beneath the cautious light of the winter sun. Rooftops sparkled with melting frost, and trees, once bowing under the storm's weight, now stood tall again, their branches dripping in rhythm with the thaw. It was the kind of quiet that only follows a night of howling wind, a silence born not of peace, but survival. Inside the hospital, the waiting room near the pediatric ICU was nearly empty. Ethan sat with his elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced together, eyes staring at a vending machine he wasn't really seeing. He wore a new clean uniform issued by the local precinct, a courtesy from Chief Alden, since his previous one had been torn and soaked beyond repair. His hair was still damp from the hospital sink, and the dark circles beneath his eyes were heavier than usual. But something had changed in his posture. A weight had lifted. Not all of it, but enough to breathe again. Rachel sat beside him, dressed in borrowed clothes from a hospital charity closet, an oversized gray sweatshirt, and a pair of faded jeans that didn't quite reach her ankles. Her hair had been brushed, pulled back into a neat bun by a volunteer nurse, and her face, though pale and tired, held a calm that hadn't been there the night before. Her hands were clasped over a styrofoam cup of tea she hadn't touched. They said nothing, and they didn't need to. It had been only hours since the helicopter landed on the hospital roof. The rotor blades had stirred the snow into a frenzy as they wheeled Mason, bundled in monitors and IVs, onto the pad. Ethan had accompanied them up, staying just until the doors shut and the aircraft lifted into the gray sky, cutting toward Helena with its most precious cargo. The call from Ken Foster had come not long before that, short, gruff, and full of something rare in the world of red tape and policy. Heart. Consider it done, Ken had said. The board approved it unanimously. Tell that boy's mother she doesn't owe us a thing. This one's on Shadow. Rachel had cried then, clutching the phone to her chest, whispering prayers she hadn't dared to speak aloud in years. Now, as the sunlight spilled through the hospital window, casting golden stripes on the white tile floor, the door down the hall swung open. A nurse in sea-green scrubs with a kind face and chestnut braid smiled softly. He's out of surgery, stable. The doctors say it went better than expected. Rachel stood so quickly her chair clattered backward. Can I see him? Soon, the nurse nodded. They're getting him settled in recovery, but he's asking for someone. Me? The nurse smiled. Actually, your dog. Rachel blinked. I don't have a dog, Ethan chuckled under his breath. He means Shadow. In the side wing of the hospital reserved for working animals, Shadow was awake and alert, his bandaged paw resting on a fleece blanket inside a large kennel crate. He had been restless since the helicopter took off, pacing in slow, deliberate circles, stopping only when he heard a child's voice through the vents above. Now, as they opened the door to his enclosure, Shadow rose to his feet slowly. Despite the wrap on his leg, his ears perked, and he tilted his head toward the familiar scent that just arrived. Rachel followed Ethan inside, watching silently as Shadow limped forward, tail wagging gently. When the boy's voice came again, soft but clear, Rachel gasped. Hey, buddy, Mason whispered. He was on a wheeled gurney pushed by a nurse, just reaching the doorway. They brought him closer, and Shadow did something he rarely did. He whined softly. ears flattening in what could only be described as emotion. The nurse gave permission, and Rachel lowered the gurney rail slightly so Mason could reach his hand out. The moment his fingers touched Shadow's head, the dog stilled completely. Mason leaned closer, barely audible. "Thank you for not leaving us. I'm gonna grow up to be like you, brave, kind, and a good boy." Shadow gave a single soft bark, and for a moment, even the nurse had to wipe her eyes. Later that afternoon, back in the waiting area, Rachel and Ethan sat once again by the window. This time, though, the silence between them wasn't born of fear or fatigue. It was reverent. Outside, the snow was melting into slush, the sky clear for the first time in days. Rachel spoke first. "Did you know, when Mason was little, he used to talk to the stars, said he thought his heart beat different because it came from somewhere else?" Ethan turned to her, listening. "I used to laugh it off, but maybe he's right, maybe it does." Ethan nodded slowly, then looked down at his lap. "My dad used to say, kindness doesn't need to roar to change the world. Sometimes it just needs to show up." She smiled. "He sounds like a good man." "He was. I think he would have liked you." They sat there, watching as the sunlight reached further across the hospital floor, golden and warm, like a promise finally kept. Meanwhile, in a small ceremony held that evening at the local precinct, a small crowd gathered around the front steps. Officers stood in dress blues, hats tucked under arms, as Chief Alden, an older man with silver hair and a slight limp, stepped forward with a velvet box. Inside lay a bronze medallion, Medal of Silent Valor, awarded only to service animals who saved human lives under extraordinary circumstances. "And this," the chief said, raising the medal before pinning it to Shadow's new vest, "is not just for what he did last night. It's for what he's always been, a protector, a guide, and a silent reminder of why we serve." The crowd applauded. Ethan knelt beside Shadow, rubbing his fur gently. Rachel, holding Mason now in a wheelchair, with a warm wool blanket, smiled from the front row. And when the applause died down, Mason leaned forward again, whispering just loud enough for Shadow to hear, "I'll make you proud. Promise." Shadow licked his cheek once, then sat upright, chest out, eyes forward, just like any hero would. It had been exactly 1 year since that storm, the storm that had pulled lives from the brink and woven them together in ways no one could have predicted. The town of Silver Hollow, now touched by early spring, was shedding its layers of frost and silence. The streets buzzed with the lazy warmth of April sunshine, and the wind carried with it not the howl of a blizzard, but the soft laughter of neighbors preparing for the annual Spring Founders Festival. Children darted through the streets with pinwheels, the scent of kettle corn hung in the air, and a band played off-key but with heart near the gazebo in Rosewood Park. Wooden booths lined the sidewalks, handcrafted jewelry, jars of wild honey, polished stone carvings, and knitted scarves no longer urgently needed. Ethan Granger stood near the edge of the park, watching the crowd with a relaxed stance, a subtle smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He was wearing a plain navy shirt, jeans, and a worn leather belt that Shadow had once tried to chew through as a pup. He looked less like an officer today, more like a man learning how to be still. His dark hair had grown a bit longer, curling slightly at the back, and there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something softened, something healed. Next to him, Shadow lay at ease on the grass, his silver-tipped ears perked as he monitored children running past with cotton candy and helium balloons. The old German shepherd, now nearing his 8th year, had recovered fully from his injury the winter prior. His canine vest had been replaced by a more flexible harness for his part-time duties, mostly school visits and community patrols. He was still sharp, still alert, but today his tail thumped lazily in rhythm to the music, eyes half-lidded with contentment. A few yards away, Rachel Myers waved from behind the health tent where she now worked as a town nurse, her uniform replaced by a floral blouse and denim skirt, hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck. She moved with quiet grace, checking in on seniors, handing out sunscreen, and laughing softly with a patient who had once refused to get vaccinated unless Rachel herself administered the shot. Her gentle demeanor made her a favorite at the local clinic, a stark contrast to the frightened, frozen woman Ethan had once found buried beneath a snowbank. At her side stood Mason, now 8, his posture straighter, skin warmer, cheeks flushed with color that hadn't graced him in years before the surgery. He wore khaki shorts, a crisp white shirt, and a bright red ribbon pinned to his chest. His heart still required checkups and care, but he ran, laughed, and climbed like any boy his age. And most days, he kept pace with Shadow around the backyard without missing a beat. Ethan had taken a step back from full-time duty after that winter, shifting to part-time work so he could be home more helping with school, teaching Mason archery in the woods behind their home, and even starting weekend classes on wilderness survival for kids at the community center. Life hadn't slowed down. It had simply shifted to a new, deeper rhythm. As the town's mayor tapped the microphone, asking for quiet, Rachel motioned Ethan over to the stage where Mason was about to speak. Mason looked up, nerves flickering in his bright eyes, and Ethan gave him a nod of encouragement. Mason took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. His voice was small at first, but steady. Last year, I lived in a cold place, not just outside, but inside my chest. He placed a hand over his heart. It was hard to breathe, hard to smile, hard to hope. But then, someone found us. A police officer, his dog, and my mom. They gave me warmth again. People leaned in closer. Parents wiped tears discreetly. My heart still beats different, but now it beats strong, because of kindness, because of people who didn't give up. So, if you ever wonder if kindness matters, it does. I'm here because of it. He paused, then pointed to the front row. That's my mom. She's the bravest person I know. And that's Officer Ethan, who taught me how to shoot a bow and how to be patient when squirrels steal your lunch. And that's Shadow. He smiled. The hero who never speaks, but always understands. The crowd erupted in applause as Mason stepped back, cheeks flushed and eyes wide with pride. Ethan reached up to high-five him as he stepped down, and Shadow stood, tail wagging slowly, before pressing his head gently against Mason's side. Later that afternoon, as festivities continued with games and music, Ethan, Rachel, and Mason sat beneath a tall elm tree at the edge of the park, a checkered blanket spread beneath them. Rachel leaned against Ethan's shoulder while Mason lay on his back, tracing cloud shapes with his finger. Shadow dozed at their feet, twitching slightly in his sleep, perhaps chasing memories of winter winds or the warmth of a child's laugh. Rachel turned to Ethan. "Do you ever miss the chaos?" Ethan glanced at the children playing nearby, then down at Shadow. "Sometimes, but not more than I love this." She nodded. "Me too." The sun began its slow descent behind the hills, and for the first time in a long time, there was no urgency in the air, no snow in the forecast, no storm on the horizon, just the soft hum of peace, a day without snow. And for them, that was everything. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or lightning. They come in the quiet form of a German shepherd's paw, pressing gently against a boy's chest. They arrive not through grand signs, but through a police officer choosing to take the long road into a storm. They bloom in the silence between two people who survived together and found home in each other. This story reminds us that God's grace often shows up when we are coldest, most afraid, and least expecting, in the warmth of a stranger's heart, in the quiet bravery of a dog who doesn't need words to speak love, and in the stillness after a storm where healing can finally begin. Whether it's a whisper in the snow or a helping hand in the dark, the Lord moves in ways we may not see until we look back and realize we were never truly alone. So as you finish this story, take a moment to think about the blessings around you, the people who stayed, the pets who wait by the door, the second chances, the days without snow. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need hope today. Comment below what part moved you most. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, redemption, and the miracles hidden in everyday life. And if you believe, as we do, that God still works through quiet hearts and unlikely heroes, type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and everyone you hold dear.